Hello. I run a page called Sane in the Asylum, which I first started to document the process of recovery from an attempt to end my life. And it slowly shifted and morphed into the recovery process that I started years earlier, um, after having left my family of origin and all of the kind of things that were brought up by that, and how it connects to my first journey that I started documenting. So today I'm going to talk about something that I has been brought up a lot as I've been going through this recovery process, and it's something that I'm going to call healing from imaginary trauma. And what I mean when I say imaginary trauma is it's not trauma that didn't happen. It's trauma that happened in a way, or it was perpetrated in a way that we never received any real acknowledgement of the trauma. So we had to compartmentalize and internalize the traumatic event and the repercussions of it as though it were imaginary, like as though it did not happen. So a lot of the times when you're a kid and you're growing up in a traumatic environment or around people who are traumatizing, who are perpetrators of these traumas, there's not any acknowledgement that a trauma has taken place, because nobody who is traumatizing you and nobody that's trying to seal off an environment where a lot of things are happening that are not supposed to be happening is going to acknowledge anything wrong that has occurred within that environment. So a lot of really bad things can happen to you, and people on the outside, still with ties to that environment, also look the other way. So it can be a situation where something really bad has happened to you, and the people who are traumatizing you are ignoring it, but also other people are also ignoring it. So you're left just to kind of flail about, really, because it doesn't erase the damage of the trauma. It doesn't erase the repercussions of the trauma. It's still going to be there. But without anybody acknowledging it, you are left, even if internally you know something about it's wrong, you're left to just kind of flail about dealing with it, because nobody's going to say that's wrong. That's not supposed to happen, because everybody is sealed in this closed off environment where somebody has made up the rules and it's being run by mental illness. So nobody is going to tell you when you are being traumatized that it's wrong. Now, because of this, and I know personally, that bar for what is acceptable and what's rational and what you can expect to happen, it's just going to keep getting bumped up. So it doesn't mean that things aren't bad. And it doesn't mean that things aren't getting worse. Sometimes things can progressively get worse. But it wasn't acknowledged down here. So you're left to believe if it's this isn't bad, and then you get up here and nobody's acknowledging that, okay, then that's not that bad. And pretty soon you can just be in a terrible, terrible situation. And you don't know really any better other than your own internal conflict that is going to be there, that is going to be running your whole life. You don't really understand until you're in a different reality, until you've been exposed to another reality. You don't understand how dysfunctional your reality really is. So some examples of imaginary trauma would be trauma that happens in the family, trauma that happens between maybe two children, and trauma that happens repeatedly by a parent. Because in those situations, a lot of the times they're just going to be written off. Because if you can't leave the situation, and if nobody's going to question what is going on in the side of that closed off environment, then you're going to be left to constantly compartmentalize your trauma as not being real. even though it is very real. And I think probably the most difficult aspect of this imaginary trauma is that if it's never acknowledged and you never know anything else besides your own internal discomfort and the meltdown that's probably happening on the inside of you all the time, until you're exposed to something else, you're not really going to have a real good understanding of what is right and what is wrong. So you can go years being exposed to horrific treatment, but without somebody stepping in. And I think that it's a lot more common than not that a lot of people that grow up in these abusive family systems, they are so submitted to those environments and so closed off from other people that I don't think the majority of them do end up in the system. So I think the majority of them, they're exposed to these environments. They have no idea really that there's anything beyond this, except for maybe in movies and TV shows and things like that. But then they get out into the world or they get into school and they make connections with other people and they're brought into their environments and they're seeing completely different things. And I think that it kind of turns your whole world upside down because it's hard to not acknowledge um, right and wrong then. Even if you're powerless to change it, you can kind of sort of understand that that trauma was real. The trauma was not imaginary. So something that's really difficult about that is that parts of you could have died years ago. But until you're exposed to an environment or a way of thinking of things can be different, it doesn't really hit you until you do see it. So it can be this awful meltdown process where you just kind of have to completely shed everything you thought you knew, and you kind of lose your faith in humanity and the system and the people that the adults, the people that were supposed to kind of make those decisions for you, make those calls for you. And it's just really difficult because you can spend years of your life being horrifically traumatized in ways that are just unspeakable. And without anybody there on the outside saying, hey, this is wrong. This shouldn't be happening. This shouldn't happen to anybody. And until or unless that comes to an end, you can't really say, that you can't really say to yourself internally that what you've experienced is a valid trauma, that it's definitely wrong, that it shouldn't be happening. Because as long as you still go back to it at night and you're still having to live it and you're still immersed in it, it's hard to believe that it is wrong. Because if it was wrong, it wouldn't be happening. It wouldn't be allowed to happen. And as an adult, you can look at that and you can understand all these gray areas and how things really play in the world between adults. But as a child, you have no understanding for that. A lot of trauma survivors, they tend to go on and get into other traumatic abusive situations. And as a child, being in one of those situations, I always thought to myself, that's not going to be me. Because I really did not have any understanding of how that could happen. Because I could see, and even if I was powerless to change it, I could see my situation. I knew that it was wrong. And I knew that once I got out of it, I was never going to be in that situation again. But when I stopped and thought about it, as an adult, when I started to realize how much of my trauma I had compartmentalized as imaginary, and I started to actually realize how many boundaries that I had set were completely off the charts wrong, that's when I began to see it. So before I might have said, I don't know how that happens, but looking back now, I can say when you have trauma, when you are traumatized and nobody acknowledges it, nobody says, that's traumatic, that's not supposed to happen, that's definitely wrong, right? When nobody says, that's definitely wrong. To you, it goes, okay, well, the next time something like that happens, you allow that bar to go a little bit higher. Because if that wasn't wrong, maybe if I let it slide to here, maybe then that'll be wrong. But then if nobody acknowledges that, it's like, okay, well, that's acceptable behavior. So you allow it to escalate here. And you go, well, is that wrong? Is somebody going to acknowledge that that's wrong? And people around you, they're not going to acknowledge it because they're all abusers or they're all submitted to this environment. So that bar can keep getting raised and keep getting raised and keep getting raised. And when you finally get out of it, you don't know where the bar should be. So you could have somebody, you could leave your situation with the bar having been up here. And if you see somebody with the bar here, you're going to see that as like a knight in shining armor or the perfect woman or whatever. You're just going to see that as the one, right? When really, it just shouldn't be there at all. But it's so easy to believe that because of all your imaginary trauma, all the trauma that you had to internalize as being not real or not valid enough to having had action taken over it. So anyways, those are my thoughts on imaginary trauma. Bye.